The third and final free practice session in Spain. The Ferrari SF-25 cars and the rest of the Formula One cars prepare for qualifying, a crucial aspect for the Maranello team this season, where Saturdays have always been problematic, except for Monaco. But we know how unique the Monte Carlo track is. The hope is that after yesterday's difficulties, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton managed to find the key with the softer tires. The two Ferrari cars wait a few minutes before going out on track, as do the vast majority of teams. The Maranello team prefers to watch others' times to assess track conditions. Meanwhile, the usual technical checks on the power unit, transmission, hybrid system, and brakes are completed without anomalies. The weather is stable, with full sun, high humidity, and temperatures slightly above average for the period. The two SF-25 cars run with different setups. Charles Leclerc opts for soft tires while Lewis Hamilton mounts mediums. The initial approach is cautious, focusing on correct tire activation. Even before the finish line, steering corrections are visible to manage the exit from the last corner. As happened the previous day, the second sector shows problems on corner entry that result in oversteer on exit. In these conditions, optimizing the thermal behavior of the compounds is particularly complex. The drivers are immediately told they need to improve performance in turns 2 and 3. For now, however, no changes are made to the front setup. The Ferrari team prefers to wait for another run before intervening on aerodynamic balance. Meanwhile, the team sets 2 slow laps to cool the tires. After the cooling laps, the Reds push again. In this second run, the car's balance appears more stable and the lack of rotation is less evident, indicating the direction taken is probably correct. Shortly after, the team starts a short race pace simulation activating the engine 4 mapping with Charles Leclerc, which is the setting used on Sunday to evaluate tire behavior over 3 consecutive high-intensity laps. Positive feelings also come from Lewis Hamilton, who during the same test as his teammate tried the engine 1 mode, corresponding to the maximum power of the thermal engine. The goal was twofold: to evaluate the impact of the mapping with a high fuel load and to measure the aerodynamic efficiency of car 44. Once the simulation ends, the Englishman returns to the pits. Charles Leclerc returns to the track with soft tires, and the latest setup changes seem to have brought some positive feedback. Ferrari appears to have found a more solid balance compared to FP1 and FP2, with a cleaner lap especially in previously more critical sections. However, McLaren responds strongly. Oscar Piastri beats Lando Norris by half a second with used tires, editor's note, and is over 7/10 ahead of Charles, who does not hide his frustration on the radio with a rather sharp comment. After the usual cooling lap, the drivers push again for a new timed attempt. Oscar Piastri's time is remarkable. Despite forecasts predicting a possible drop in McLaren's performance due to the new technical directive, the numbers on track tell a different story. In fact, the Woking team looks more competitive than ever. Given McLaren's expertise in managing aeroelasticity effects, it is likely that the TD018 affected their package less than expected. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton complains of a gearbox issue on the last lap that prevents him from downshifting correctly. The session ends with a Ferrari improving but still distant from McLaren, which confirms itself as the car to beat looking towards the qualifying session at the Circuit de Catalunya. Each year in Barcelona, Pirelli brings the hardest compounds in its range because the high-speed corners, which transfer a lot of energy to the tires, the high temperatures and aggressive asphalt, require more resistant rubber. That was the case again this season, yet there's something curious and unusual. The hardest compounds do not seem to be working, to the benefit of the softer ones. It almost seems paradoxical, because both on single laps and over long distances, the soft tire has proven to be the best compound among those brought by Pirelli to Barcelona, so much so that it's expected to be used in 2 separate stints, alternated with a harder compound, just like in 2024. This leads to an interesting consideration. Why has the hard not managed to be effective, to the point that teams already discarded a set during FP1? It is logical to think that, with this choice, the teams were already aware that the hardest compound wouldn't be very competitive, and the trend appears to follow what has been seen in the past. Due to its layout, the Barcelona track requires rather significant compromises, not so much, or not only, in terms of balancing slow and high-speed corners, but especially in how the 2 axles are managed. The many quick corners, high temperatures, and one of the most aggressive surfaces of the season push teams to choose carefully which axle to prioritize. Too much understeer. In an effort to protect the rear tires, ends up destroying the front left in high-speed corners, like turn 3 or the final 2 fast corners of the third sector. On the other hand, if the setup focuses on protecting the front to reduce understeer, the risk becomes excessive stress on the rear tires. This will likely be a key theme for the race, and it will be interesting to observe how the track evolves once more rubber is laid down. Simone Barra from Pirelli explained that thermal degradation originates from traction zones, mainly those after the first chicane, after turn 5, and after turn 10, which are the most critical points for traction. He confirmed how complex it is to find the right balance between the front and rear axles. As for the front, he noted that it is especially overloaded in turn 3, which is a very long corner. The front left tire is more heavily loaded than the rear left, which leads to high temperatures even on the front axle. Therefore, it is essentially a matter of keeping the temperature low on both axles. It was no coincidence that many teams were seen experimenting yesterday to find the right balance between front and rear, with wing changes, as in the case of McLaren, or a more unstable rear end, as seen on Red Bull and Ferrari, who will certainly aim to correct this, especially for qualifying. Finding this balance proved even more difficult with the C1 hard tire, which provides less mechanical grip and tends to slide more, triggering overheating and further reducing traction. Perhaps a more rubbered-in track could help, but on Friday it was the worst-performing compound of the three, especially considering that this year the C2 has been brought closer to the C3 in terms of performance. Indeed, during the first session, several drivers, including Lewis Hamilton, immediately reported how little grip the hardest compound offered, both on single laps, which wasn't a surprise, and over long runs. Realistically, teams had already predicted this scenario in pre-weekend simulations, also based on historical data, which is why they discarded it right away in FP1. Simone Barra added that the C1 struggles with sliding, which creates significant overheating and thus poor pace. On paper, it is the most thermally resistant tire. However, the Italian noted that it doesn't manage to generate grip on the asphalt, so the race pace simply doesn't materialize. Unsurprisingly, Pirelli believes that the strategy most top teams should follow is soft/medium/soft, although surprises could arise, like in last year's race, when an early pit stop led to a more creative strategy. Furthermore, the soft tire at the start should offer extra grip, which is helpful given the long straight heading into turn 1 and the importance of avoiding dirty air in the early laps. Simone Barra explained that, from Pirelli's point of view, the C3 and C2 are very similar. He stated that the C3 is a good race tire and that since degradation is high if there isn't a sharp drop in performance, if front left wear doesn't reach 100%, and the tires can be managed properly, then the C3 becomes a good long-run option. On a long stint, he noted, its pace was quite similar to the C2. The Italian also added that this was something they observed last year too, so they were not really surprised. Moreover, this year the C2 and C3 are even closer, since last year's C2 had less grip and thus struggled more like the C1. By contrast, this year's C2 offers more grip and is closer to the C3.